How's it hanging, everybody? So today we are talking about one of my favorite topics of all time, the Nintendo Game Boy. Because Game Boy games just recently, in the past couple weeks, came to the Nintendo Switch Online service. So now we get to daydream about all the titles that might eventually come to the service, and we might get a few of those, and the rest we can just daydream about. But it's cool though, because I promise you some of the ones on this list here we're definitely going to see on the service at some point. It's bound to happen. We've got a lot of Nintendo published properties right here that we're going to talk about, and today we're talking about JRPGs on the Game Boy and on the Game Boy Color. I would like to leave Game Boy Advance for perhaps a future video. If we included Game Boy Advance, we would be here all night, and I'd like to go to sleep tonight. So we're just going to keep it with Game Boy and Game Boy Color. But let me tell you something. If you're too young to remember the days of the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, I'm certainly not. I'm quite old, so I remember all that stuff. The Game Boy lasted 9 years before the Game Boy Color came out, and we got just an avalanche of titles over that time. I mean, the Game Boy games were cheaper probably to make, to produce, and get out the door than, say, a NES or Super Nintendo game. And so we just got absolutely pummeled with titles over that course of that 9 years. And then on top of that, we got a few more years with the Game Boy Color. And the Game Boy Color did a tremendous amount in a very short period of time. So we're going to be here for a while, but I really wanted to talk about this because the reality is Game Boy is just a great, amazing, expansive platform in terms of its catalog, but it's also a great catalog of JRPGs, and that's what we like to cover sometimes here on the channel. So without further ado, let's get started. The Pokemon series, that's where we have to start. It just is what it is. The Pokemon series, we got the originals. Red, Blue, Yellow came out a little later, and then for the Game Boy Color, we have Gold, Silver, and Crystal came out a little after those. You guys know the deal here. We, of course, should absolutely have those titles on the service here. So I'm going to go ahead and slam them all right to the top. Let's just not mess around. The Pokemon games, we need them. We need integration with Pokemon Home. It would be a great time. And I did actually own, as a kid, I owned Pokemon Blue. And I played it for a little while, but I was a little bored by it. And I didn't actually play my first Pokemon game until recently with Scarlet. So yes, I'm a man in my 40s and I just played my first Pokemon game. Ask me anything. Okay, so that takes care of those. There's really not much else to say about the Pokemon games. We know Pokemon. So next up, we got 2 Mario sports games. As you might have figured out, we're talking about the Nintendo properties, the Nintendo published properties in these first handful of entries. So that's what these are. Mario Golf, Mario Tennis. Now, these are, of course, not pure RPGs, but they do have RPG-like story modes, which went on to inspire games like Golf Story and Soccer Story, some of the recent indie titles that came out. I don't know if you'd call them recent, like past 5 years or so. But anyway, these are great games. They're made by Nintendo. They feature Mario. I can think of no reason why we shouldn't get these games on the service. So let's go ahead, put these 2 particular ones up top. We're already getting pretty crowded up there up top, but I think these are all very realistic expectations. I should mention though, I wonder if Nintendo is going to give us another tier of their online service just for mainline Pokemon games. We already have some Pokemon games in the service, but I wonder if they would pull a fast one on us and make like the Pokepack or the Pokepass expansion where you have to get this other thing for the Pokemon games, and maybe it's included with the expansion pass, but maybe you can also just buy the Pokepass and get these extra games, just the Pokemon games, if that's all you want. I don't know. The thing is, I think they know the value of these games. They know the value of the property of Pokemon, the largest intellectual property in the world, it so happens to be. So it'll be interesting to see what their move is with these games. And we're going to find out pretty soon in a Pokemon presentation or whatever. Okay, next up we got Game Boy Wars. Game Boy Wars. This is originated from Famicom Wars, which eventually became Advance Wars, which we're soon getting a remake of, 1 and 2. So this is a cool, very cool piece of history. The problem, it was only in Japan and it's not available in English. Now, Nintendo has brought Japanese games to the Switch Online service, but they're not games with very much text at all. Like basically just a few menu selections and that's about it. So there's a little more to translate here. It's obviously very doable. I would love to see Game Boy Wars in the service, but I don't know if it's really realistic. I don't know. I mean, maybe if Advance Wars does tremendously well, then they might consider it. But I'm going to go ahead and put Advance Wars in gimme, but let's be realistic. It's unrealistic that we would get that one. Okay, next up, we got For the Frog, the Bell Tolls. Now, this is a very interesting title because this game actually launched the engine that eventually made Link's Awakening. So Link's Awakening was built in the engine for this game, For the Frog, the Bell Tolls. So this game looks pretty much identical to Link's Awakening, from the text to the tiles to the characters. Everything looks extremely familiar, and I like that. It feels like, feels almost like you're playing a strange Zelda game that's a little off the beaten path. I don't know, but I haven't played this. This is definitely on my list. It's like a top 10 JRPG must-play game for me. The problem with this one, it's also only in Japanese and was only released in Japan. So that's a little tricky. I think that we're going to have to put this one as well in gimme, but it's unrealistic because I don't necessarily think Nintendo would give us this one. I will say, I can't remember who it was. It was either Nintendo Life or Good Vibes Gaming did a really cool feature on this game. And so I would recommend looking that up and going and checking it out. Again, that's For the Frog, the Bell Tolls. Next up, we have a game called Monster Tactics, and it, I think, is more of a pure tactics game. I don't really know much about this one. It is published by Nintendo, and it is Japan only. I'm just going to say pass on this one because I've never heard of it really until I started making this list, and I don't necessarily think it's going to resonate here in the West. So, let's put something else on the service instead. Okay, next up, Final Fantasy Adventure. Now, you might not know, but this Final Fantasy game, was published by Nintendo in Europe. So Nintendo has a publishing history with this title. This is actually the first game in the Mana series, or Seiken Densetsu. So that's really cool. I haven't played this one. I think it's been remade a few times as like Adventure of Mana and maybe Sword of Mana on various platforms over time. But of course, this is the OG version. The tricky part about this one is this is already available on the Switch. You can pick this up in the Collection of Mana. So it's not really a needed title. I would say that it's welcome, but not essential. We don't really truly need it, but if it lands in the service, I'm certainly not going to be complaining. And, it does bear, obviously, the Final Fantasy banner, but it's really more of I think that was just more of a branding thing. It's truly more of a Seiken Densetsu Mana title than it is a Final Fantasy title, if that's important to you. Okay, next up we have Harvest Moon GB and Legend of the River King GB. These are both Natsume titles, both kind of, edge case RPGs, where Harvest Moon's obviously farming simulator, Legend of the River King's more of a fishing game, but they both have core RPG mechanics. Harvest Moon is still really popular today with Story of Seasons, and of course Stardew Valley kind of remade and revamped the Harvest Moon formula and sort of perfected it, I think, in a lot of people's eyes. But this is a really cool piece of history. I would say for both of these, Again, both of these are Nintendo published, but in Europe. Let's see. People would be stoked to see a Harvest Moon game. I think people know less about Legend of the River King. For me, I'm going to say Harvest Moon is welcome but not essential. I think I'm going to do that with both of them because they would be both really cool, and Nintendo does have a publishing history with those titles, so hopefully we might see those someday. Okay, next up. This is one of my most... this is something I'm excited about on the list. Dragon Slayer. The interesting thing about Dragon Slayer is it's from Nihon Falcom, the company that's brought us the Ys games, the Trails games. And the interesting thing about Dragon Slayer is it's actually older than both Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. This is regarded as the first true action RPG, I guess the first true action RPG. I don't know if it's the first Japanese action RPG or the first action RPG. I can't quite remember. It was released in 1984. And is it a great game to play today? Not really. Probably not. This Game Boy version, I think, came out in about 1990, and it's a port of the original, PC 88 game from in Japan. Japan had their own, computers back then, kind of like we had here in the West. We had our Apple computers and IBM computers and stuff like that. And in Europe, they had the Commodore and the Amiga. And in Japan, they had the PC 88, along with some other stuff. And this was a PC 88 game, and it came to other computer platforms. But it was only really ported to, the only console it was ever ported to was, I think, the Game Boy and also maybe the Saturn in some Falcom collection later on. This is a cool piece of history. I would love to have this game on the platform. But it is in Japanese. It is Japan only. It has never been ported to in the West at all. So this is a purely Japanese game. How cool would it be to see Nintendo do a little deal with Nihon Falcom and bring us this super historic title on Switch Online? I think it would be cool. Again, probably not the most fun game, but sometimes when you're looking at things like Game Boy games, sometimes it's a little more of a history lesson, right? So with this one, I'm saying gimme that, but we have to be realistic. It is unrealistic that we will get that, but here's hoping. Next up, we have Dragon Slayer. By the way, we're done with the Nintendo published games. It's third party from here on out, so we're getting very much into daydreamy territories. But I would hope that Nintendo can figure out a way to give us some of these titles. Here's hoping. But anyway, now we have another Dragon Slayer game. This is Dragon Slayer Gaiden. And I don't know as much about this one. And I don't think it has the same historical significance. It's also a Japan-only title. I'm just going to move on from this one because for me, the much more important title, the much more significant title to get would be the original Dragon Slayer. Okay, up next we have Survival Kids 1 and 2. These are really fun, really cool survival RPGs, I guess you could say. They have they kind of look like a Legend of Zelda game or something like that, but when you actually start to play them, they are very much like you have to find resources, you have to craft things, you have to cook food, you have a thirst meter, you have to make sure your food doesn't spoil, you have to fight wild animals some of the time. So you are stranded on an island and you have to survive and find your way off of the island. And these games are amazing. Like, these are some of the coolest Game Boy games out. These are Game Boy Color games. Survival Kids came to the North America. I think it was released as Stranded Kids in Europe. And then Survival Kids 2 didn't make it out of Japan, unfortunately. But there is a fan translation out there. I would love to have these games. I'm going to go ahead and say for Survival Kids, let's go ahead and put that one at the tippy top since we already have an English translation. Should be easy peasy, assuming they can get the deal done with Konami. And then have they put Konami games in the Switch Online service? I think maybe they have, but I'm not positive. But anyway, So now we have Survival Kids 2. What do we do with this one? It's Japan only. I think it's just as good, if not better, than the first game from what I hear. This one, let's put this one in welcome, but not essential. I'm not on purpose ignoring the bottom tiers, guys. I'm just excited about Game Boy. And I did do quite a lot of trimming of the fat before I really put this list together. There are many more RPGs on the platform, but we're sticking to the ones that are a little more known, a little more relevant. Okay. Tower of Druaga. This is a kind of like Dragon Slayer. This is a very historic game here. I think it started maybe as an arcade game, and it plays much like an arcade game. It's kind of like a really, really obtuse, like arcade-based Legend of Zelda, I guess. It definitely inspired Legend of Zelda. And this one is cool, but I don't think it's very fun. It's definitely got the historical significance happening, cool history lesson, but I don't think it has the same pop as Dragon Slayer. I'm fine with not getting this one. And you can play Tower of Druaga in other versions on the Switch, but not this particular one. I'm cool with saying farewell to that one. Okay, up next we have Mysterium. Mysterium is a very unique game on the Game Boy, I think. It's a first-person perspective dungeon crawler game with very, very crude, very kind of linear graphics, I would say. Like, I don't know, it's difficult to explain, but if you're familiar with Mac Venture, the genre of game where we had these very interesting looking black and white early point and click adventure titles on early Macintosh Apple computers, that's kind of what this game is. It's just on the Game Boy. And to be honest, this game I think is just never got any good reviews. I don't think it's really a significant title, but it does look very interesting, so I thought I might mention it. I mean, I'm going to go ahead and say take it or leave it, because if what it does not have in fun factor, I think it makes up for a little bit in just being a really unique title, unique sense of humor, and just a very unique look as well. Okay, next up, we have Cave Noir. This is a game that I've been wanting to talk about on this channel for a long time. Never really had a reason to or a way to. But Cave Noir, Japanese only game, but there's a fan translation, and it is so much freaking fun. Like, this game is a roguelite type of game. It plays weirdly similarly to like a kind of roguelite mystery dungeon type game that might come out these days in modern times. You have progression throughout the system or throughout the different levels and dungeons that you fight. You have, let's see. In Cave Noir, you have like inventory management that you have to do. It has the grid-based like movement system where you move once, your enemy moves once. So it's basically turn-based, but pretty fast turn-based if you want it to be. Feels like a mystery dungeon game. It feels like a roguelite game. It's procedurally generated. Every dungeon, everything you navigate through is going to be a little bit different every time, which is really cool. Really dig that. Such a weirdly modern game. I picked up this game, or I started trying this game out on the Analog Pocket, and I have had a blast with Cave Noir. Another Konami title. I want this game to be translated. I mean, there's virtually no story. This is kind of one of those, if you want to play a JRPG and check it off your list and just play it really fast, like, this is probably one to look at. But you're not necessarily going to beat it really fast, because you have to play, it's just like a roguelike game. You got to play and play and play, and you have a run, and some runs are good, some runs are bad, and eventually you beat the game. But I've actually personally never beat it. It's a little tough. It's a little tough for me. But I'm going to put this one in give me, but it's not realistic, unfortunately. Next up, we have a game from the Megami Tensei series. That's right. Like SMT games right here on the Game Boy. Now, this particular Megami Tensei game is called Revelations: The Demon Slayer. I think that the Japanese title was The Last Bible, maybe. And this particular title came out in North America. It's an Atlas game, as all Megami Tensei games are. And why would we not want to have a cool, like, Game Boy Color Megami Tensei game? You know, Megami Tensei, SMT or whatever, Shin Megami Tensei, when you think about that series in sort of a modern, in a modern context, it's such a modern feeling game. It's so, like, edgy, and it's got the kind of, like, Pokemon, you know, you fuse monsters, you collect monsters, you level them up, and it's just the story and the lore and everything is just so edgy. You don't get stuff like that very often in video games, but you do in Megami Tensei. And this old game, from what I understand, has all that same edge just on the Game Boy platform. So I think that's, excuse me, burping. I think that's super cool. I'm going to put this one all the way up top. Is that where I want to put that one? I think that one would be really cool. Yeah, I'm going to put that one way up top. The next up is the sequel to that game, which, as you can guess, Japan only, unfortunately. And I'm going to go ahead and pass on that one. I think it's virtually super unrealistic that we would get that one, since they would have to translate the whole thing and stuff. Okay, next up, we have 5, count them, 5, technically 6, Dragon Quest titles. And if you know me, on this channel, I like talking about Dragon Quest, so here we go. This is back when the game was called Dragon Warrior. It was before they had the name change here in the West. And we have a compilation of Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, ported to this platform, ported to the Game Boy Color. And a lot of people say this is the best way to play Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, and 3. 3 was released separately, as we can see down here. We got 1 and 2, and then we got 3. So Dragon Warrior 3, considered one of the best JRPGs out there, getting remade in HD 2D, so we have that to look forward to. I want these very badly. And the really cool thing about these, if we got these, this would probably be most Dragon Quest fans, this would probably be their, like, number one way to play the game. This would be the definitive way to play these games, because the versions that we have on, like, the Switch and the PS4, they're the mobile port, basically. It's the mobile game that was made years and years ago, and then it was ported to the Switch and to PS4, and doesn't look good, doesn't run very good. It gets the job done, but I think that these are much more palatable right here, these Game Boy Color versions. So I'm going to put Dragon Quest 3 at the top. And I hope Nintendo makes some kind of deals with Square Enix and their Switch Online service, because we still need Super Mario RPG on the NES. And it would be really cool to get the original Chrono Trigger, or, there's so many games, so many Square Enix games over the years that we could have on the platform. Square Enix, they're not releasing a lot of these games, so maybe Nintendo could. I don't know. Okay, Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, I'm going to put those in welcome but not essential. I just think that they are probably the Dragon Warrior games that are probably the lowest on everyone's list, just because they are so early and primitive. But I think they're super cool because I'm just a Dragon Quest stan like that. But I think we should have Dragon Quest 3. I think that should be priority. Okay, and now we have Dragon Warrior Monsters. Dragon Warrior Monsters, as well as Dragon Warrior Monsters 2. Dragon Warrior Monsters 2 was split up into 2 games, kind of like Pokemon titles. And one is called Dragon Warrior Monsters 2, Cobi's Journey. The other is called Terra's Journey. So you can play as a boy protagonist or a girl protagonist. And I guess probably like Pokemon, maybe there's some variations in the different monsters you can collect in each version. These games are very well liked. If you like Pokemon games, you would probably like these. I would love to see these games in the service, and they're so mobile or portable, handheld friendly that they're very, very appealing. So for me, I think that the Dragon Warrior 2 games are probably, most people say they're a little better from what I can remember. So I'm putting these Dragon Warrior Monsters 2 games in gimme. And then the next one we're just going to put, or the original, we can put in welcome but not essential. Okay, next up, Lufia. Lufia, The Legend Returns. Okay, so I don't know a ton about this title, and honestly I don't know a lot about the Lufia series. I know that a lot of people love Lufia, especially the second game on the Super Nintendo. Apparently it's the best, like one of the best like improvements from the original to a sequel in gaming history, the way it just completely revamps everything. This is technically the third game in the I think in the series, and I think also the chronology. I think it's the third chronological game, I believe. This game has a reputation as a Game Boy Color game for looking really spectacular. Like, I've seen a lot of screenshots of this game. Looks like a 16-bit game. Very beautiful, like, backgrounds, very beautiful world maps, stuff like that. This one would be a really cool one. I'm going to go ahead and say, for me, welcome but not essential. Next up is Azure Dreams. And Azure Dreams, another Konami title. Man, Konami, they were going wild with RPGs on the Game Boy back in the day. So props to Konami, who's, I think, going to be at E3 this year. Isn't that kind of weird? They're done with pachinko for a minute anyway. Okay, so Azure Dreams is a port, a demake of sorts, of a PlayStation 1 game. And it has roguelike characteristics, I believe. Kind of like Lufia that I just mentioned. It looks great. It's a really great looking game. And I think this one would be really cool. It apparently has it's more feature complete and content complete than the PlayStation 1 version. So even though it's just an 8-bit demake of a 32-bit CD-ROM game, it's still, I think, actually maybe the preferred version to play. I don't know. This one, a lot of people say that this is their favorite Game Boy RPG. But I just don't know. I just don't know about Azure Dreams. Have you played Azure Dreams? Do you have an opinion on this title? I'm going to go ahead and say take it or leave it. There's just so many that I would rather see in the service than that one. So let's make that one take it or leave it. Next up we have Quest, Brian's Journey. Wow. This game I never even knew existed until I started making this list. This game is a sequel, or actually a demake, of the worst N64 game known to man, Quest 64. I think the only reason anybody knows what Quest 64 is because the N64 had virtually no RPGs. It was not a good RPG system. That was the PlayStation. The N64, Nintendo went from this gold mine of RPGs on the Super Nintendo to the N64, where we get Quest 64. And this is a demake of Quest 64. And it looks bad, and I'm sure it is bad, and I want it. I want Quest Brian's Journey to be on the NSO service. I also want Quest 64 to be on the NSO service because I need comedy. I need comic relief in this service. I know that's very selfish of me, but I would be, I'm going to go ahead and put this one on gimme because let's do this one. Let's have this one. This one would be really fun to have. I mean, a lot of the games on this list, they're not the best games out there. Quest Brian's Journey, most certainly not the best game out there, but good for a laugh, I'm sure. Okay, next up, home stretch here. But we got Bomberman Quest. Now, Bomberman Quest is really interesting because kind of like that For the Frog, the Bell Toll games I mentioned earlier, this game looks pretty much identical to Link's Awakening. In this particular case, it looks like Link's Awakening DX because this is the color version or this is on the Game Boy Color rather. Bomberman Quest, kind of a short action RPG. Everything looks like Link's Awakening. The text, the characters, the trees, the tiles, everything looks very familiar in that way. I think even the bosses kind of look and feel like Link's Awakening bosses. And I hear the game's actually pretty decent. So for this one, I'm going to say welcome, but not essential. Would be really cool to see that one. And it would be cool to just see, you know, I mean, how many Bomberman RPGs are you going to play in your life? Probably just that one. That's probably going to be the only one there ever is. Next up, we have a Star Ocean game, Star Ocean Blue Sphere. And I believe Blue Sphere is the third game in the series. And I don't know a lot about Star Ocean. I know that it has some diehard fans out there. I know they came out with a Star Ocean game last year, 2022. Got pretty good reviews and stuff. This one is one of the better looking games on the list as far as I know. I've seen screenshots and I've booted this game up and I've gone through the opening moments before. It's a really good looking game. Like, it starts out very almost like, you know, I mean, it feels ridiculous to say photorealistic for a Game Boy title, but you know, it looks like it's some of the best graphics I've seen in those early moments. When you keep playing the game, it kind of looks a little more basic, a little more like a Zelda or, you know, just like an old school 8-bit RPG, but it has some very interesting moments. I don't know how good this one is. I'm going to say take it or leave it for Star Ocean Blue Sphere. And there we have it. That's all of our RPGs on the Game Boy that I decided to include on the list. Like I said, there's a lot more. But that pretty much takes care of it. So guys, listen. If you've made it this far, I have a request for you. I am on Twitter. And Twitter still exists. It was supposed to be like dead by now, I think. But it's still totally around and sort of works, I guess. So I'm on there. And that's the primary way that you can interact with me off of YouTube. So I would appreciate a follow or two. I have not really promoted the Twitter at all, so I have like virtually no followers. So if you happen to frequent Twitter, you want to hit me up on there. You know, the more followers I have, the more I'll tweet and stuff like that. So if you want to hit me up on Twitter, come check me out. And thanks for checking me out today on this video. Later.